Hey guys, Coach Logan here again, this time with another video in my Elements of Chess series. And in this one, I wanted to talk about space. So I think space is one of the most difficult concepts for players to understand on an accurate level. I think a lot of times it gets explained as meaning who is controlling more of the board. And there's, who is controlling more of the board could be said to have a space advantage. But I think that's actually inaccurate. I think there's more to it than that. There's a lot more nuance there that should be explored. So let's take a look, for instance, at this starting position. If I were to ask you who has more space here, it's immediately clear white has more space. White's pawns are pushing deep into black's territory. You could try counting who's controlling more squares, but I think that's unnecessary. It's just immediately obvious white has more space. However, I do not believe white has a space advantage, and it's pretty simple why. There's no way for him to break through. For instance, we could try moving our king in, but you'll notice we can't get into d5. We can't get into a6. I'm just going to highlight these squares. We can't get into g6 because of black's pawns. Our own pawns are covering the other entry points, so I don't actually see any way for white to improve his position here. It might look nice, maybe black's in a smaller box, but it's really hard to actually find a way to break through. And if you turn on an engine, I'm just going to turn on Stockfish here, you'll see, give it a moment, at first it's all happy, but then it calculates and it just spits out 0.00 in every line. There's just no way for white to actually improve his position. So while white has more space here, I don't believe white has a space advantage. Conversely, let's look at a different position now. Let's say I have this position up here. Okay, here we have basically the exact same position with one crucial difference, which is I added a minor piece for each side. So for black, I added this bishop. For white, I added this knight on d2. That's an enormous difference. Okay, now if we look at the position, white is just immediately winning. For instance, a move I like here would be something like knight to e4, with the idea that now this knight is both threatening to hop into d6 with a really nasty check, or potentially go into g5 and then just grab this pawn on h7. And meanwhile, black has no way to deal with these threats, just absolutely none. If he tries to go and defend his h-pawn with something like king f8, okay, you don't have to play knight to g5 anymore, although truthfully you could even do that and you're still much better, but just something like knight to d6, and now you're hitting this bishop on c8. It only has one square to move to, which is d7 if they don't want to just lose the bishop, and now white just grabs this pawn, and eventually this b pawn will queen and white should win the game. Okay, so what a difference a pair of minor pieces makes, right? And this gets at a key point, which is that space is really only an advantage or disadvantage in relation to the pieces you have on the board. If the reason space can be an advantage is because it generally gives you more squares for your pieces, which gives you more opportunities to put them on good squares. So in particular, I find this is true for minor pieces. Minor pieces generally really operate well with extra space. So now I want to shift to a classic game that I think really highlights how to use a space advantage. So this is, here, let me pull this up. I'm actually joining in the middle of the game here. This is Rubinstein versus Schlechter. It's a game from the early 1900s, I think 1912. So Rubinstein is playing white here. And in this position, I think it was, black just castled in this position. And you'll notice a few things. One is, if you're newer at this, you might think, well, I don't know, white's king is on d2, maybe he can't castle, that could be bad. But then I would argue, well, we've already had a queen trade, so this king is not really that unsafe. And I think the most salient feature in this position is that white has more space. White has this kind of classic pawn center with pawns on d4 and e4. His pieces are going to have better squares to operate on. And here, I'm going to pick it up with this move. Rubinstein played an excellent move here, which was bishop to b5. The point being, it's just kind of bearing down on these any of the squares the knight might go to. which also makes it difficult to activate the knight without causing problems. For instance, if the knight were to come somewhere like c6. I mean, potentially white could even just take that and isolate black's pawn. If black were to try something like bishop to d7 to challenge the bishop, white could just take and then I think just win this pawn on b7. So bishop b5 is a very kind of annoying move in terms of restricting black's mobility, and it's a provocative move in that it entices black to do what he did, which is play a6. But we'll notice this actually creates further weaknesses. Black has now weakened some of these dark squares like b6, and further weaken this b7 pawn, which is going to be a backwards pawn now. So it's a very good move from Rubinstein. He plays bishop d3 now. Note he could have directly played bishop d3, right? And it would be black's turn to move here, in a very similar position. But I like the way he did it. I love this bishop b5 sort of pendulum maneuver. The bishop comes out, provokes this pawn push, and then just drops back, weakening this b7 pawn. All right, so let's continue. So black plays rook to d8, which seems quite reasonable. White plays rook h to c1, just bringing rooks to good squares. Black now plays b5, sort of a necessity to try to get out these queenside pieces. And white plays rook to c7, invading onto the 7th rank. Okay, an excellent use of his rooks. Before, his rooks were bothering these pawns. Now that the pawn has shifted, white is now entering the 7th rank, which still makes it hard for black to get out his pieces, like this bishop. Black plays knight to d7. And here, white plays another very good move, king to e3, which, one thing that's important is as you approach the endgame, the king no longer is a passive piece, right? The king actually has useful potential in the later stages of the game. It can move to 8 squares at once, which is the same number of squares as a knight, so it's, in fact, it moves in a more logical way, so in some ways it's kind of almost like a 4-point piece, and white is using his king effectively here, just holding the center, okay? Holding the center, not pushing either of these pawns, just continuing to control all of these key squares, depriving black's pieces of those squares. So black plays knight to f6 here, potentially threatening something like knight to g4 check, which could be annoying for white's king. So white just continues to, White just continues to move his pieces to good squares. He plays knight, he plays knight to e5, which improves the position of his knight and controls the g4 square, now taking it away from black's knight. Likewise, this is also pressuring the f7 square. So black now has to do something to deal with that. So he plays bishop to d7, just blocking the rook rather kind of crudely from taking on f7, and white just continues to turn up the pressure here with the move pawn to g4. Very, very nice move. The idea is pretty direct. White wants to play pawn to g5, kicking this knight and just further knocking it onto a worse square. Also, pawn to g5, if this knight has to move, this bishop will be hanging because white has 2 pieces attacking it. Currently, black has 2 defending it, but if the knight has to move, that won't be the case. So black plays h6 to prevent g5, and white just continues grabbing more space and reissuing the threat with pawn to f4. Black plays bishop to e8 so that the bishop is no longer a loose piece on d7, and white just continues. Pawn to g5, kicking the knight back, kicking the knight further back to a terrible square on h7. Now white does not want to do anything with this pawn that would give the knight squares again, so he simply defends it with h4. Black challenges the white rook, and now again, especially for the kids in the audience, I would say, what would you do here when black challenged the rook? So pause if you want more time. But I see kids make a mistake quite frequently when somebody plays a rook move to challenge your rook on a file. One big mistake is kids will often take and just give the opponent the open file. That's almost never the right idea. What you want to do is just support your rook here with rook b to c1 and stay in control of the file. Learn to live with the tension. It's a sign of being a strong player. And in this position, I just want to point out, again, this is just such a good example of how a spatial advantage can be used effectively. Every white piece in this position is superior to the counterpart on black's side. So for instance, white's rooks are both better than black's rooks. They're more active. White's bishop is more active than black's bishop. White's bishop is putting pressure on some of the black pawns. Black's bishop is relegated to defending them. White's knight is clearly better than black's knight, and white's king is clearly better than black's king. That is a that is typical of a position where you have a significant spatial advantage, is your pieces just become higher quality because they have better squares, right? So black trades rooks, white takes, black plays rook to d8, and white now continues with rook to a7, targeting this weak a6 pawn, right? Black, it's kind of hard to actually defend that. Black plays f6 to challenge the knight. But this is another kind of key point when you have a spatial advantage, is a lot of times your opponent feels squeezed, and what they'll do is they'll make like a desperate pawn thrust just to try to open up the board for their pieces, but inevitably these always just make weaknesses. So f6 is, okay, for the moment kicking the knight, white trades, but black has now further weakened the 7th rank, and he has weakened the h6 square and the f6 square, which become relevant in a moment after knight to g4, potentially eyeing moves like knight into h6. Black plays bishop to h5 there, and white now plays knight to h6 check, king to h8. And now a really nice move from white. White would really like to play knight f7. That would just fork the king and the rook. However, the black bishop is defending, so I'll give you a moment in the audience to try to figure out what white plays here. But I'm going to continue, so pause if you want time to solve that. White plays bishop e2, deflecting the bishop. If black were to take this, white wins with a fork. It's kind of simple tactics, but the tactics aren't really the point here. It's understanding the strategic ideas. Black just instead plays bishop back to e8. Again, every move he has to make is reactionary and kind of defensive. Black, it's hard to come up with plans for black in this position. White ends up stealing a pawn on a6. Black plays king g7 now, getting his king out. Knight back to g4. f5, this is another one of those kind of hopeful pawn thrusts to just try to create room for black to play actively. After f5, white checks again with the rook, driving black's king back. Knight comes back to e5, another good active square, and black takes this pawn. And again, I would give you a moment in the audience to try to come up with white's move here. White could take this pawn on e4, and probably is still solidly better if he were to do that, but I like the move he does even more. Keep it paused if you want more time. White just grabs an even more important pawn on b5. I say that's more important because these pawns are kind of doubled and not that effective. This pawn is a little bit annoying for white, who's trying to get his a pawn rolling. So white just grabs this pawn, and once again, we're seeing the same kind of motif. Black can't grab the bishop because knight to f7 is forking the king and the rook. So black instead plays knight to f6. This is in a modern game with like strong players. This might just be a resignable position for black, but they played it out a bit more. Bishop takes e8, rook takes e8, king f4. White is, again, I mentioned using the king actively at the end of the game, and white is doing that here. King starting to invade. King to g8. King to g5, rook to f6 defending the knight, and king to g6, and at this point black did indeed resign. The threats are just mounting in this position. For instance, like say black were to try to run his pawn. I believe after rook to g7 check, king to h8, and now, knight to f7 is quite strong. This is check. Black is forced to take this knight because there's no other way out of this, and the computer's giving me rook takes here, which is nice because now you're threatening this knight, and then once the knight moves, I think you have rook f8, so the knight, it's kind of hard to come up with a move here. If the knight, like for instance, goes to a logical square, like knight to d5, then rook f8 is checkmate. If the knight drops back to d7, you can take it. If the knight drops to h7, you can take it. So this is just lost. Okay, so a beautiful win by Rubinstein. Really, again, just showing when you have more space, you have better squares for your pieces. And if you can just kind of maneuver between those better squares successfully, a lot of times that's enough to win a game.